Ever since she first met and fell in love with Elvis Presley in 1959, when she was just 14 years old.
The end of the fairy tale marriage to the king of rock and roll and the years that followed.
She had Elvis Presley and never had anyone after him because she never truly moved on. For over 50 years, every eligible man in Hollywood circled Priscilla Presley. She turned every single one away. Not because she was broken, and not for the reasons people assume, but because of something nobody ever discovered until now. The woman who rebuilt Graceland from bankruptcy. The actress who became a star on her own terms. The mother who outlived her daughter. At 81, the last surviving member of the original Elvis family is still keeping the most important promise she never said out loud. Until now. The beginning of a life that stopped being her own. She was just 14 years old when she met Elvis Presley. In 1959, Priscilla Presley had just arrived in West Germany after her stepfather was stationed there with the U.S. Air Force. Priscilla had barely settled into the new country when she was introduced to a 24-year-old soldier at a casual house party. The soldier was also one of the most famous entertainers on Earth. Elvis Presley had been drafted into the army while already a global music icon, and the small American community in Germany rotated around his presence the way planets orbit a star. Elvis was immediately drawn to Priscilla. The quiet, dark-haired girl reminded him of his mother, Gladys, who had passed away the previous year. Elvis was still grieving deeply, and Priscilla's gentle presence and soft beauty struck something in him that the other women around him did not reach. The attention from someone like Elvis felt overwhelming and unreal to a girl who had just changed countries and schools. Over the following months, Elvis invited Priscilla back repeatedly. He was kind and focused on winning not just her trust, but the approval of her parents, showing up to meet the family in military uniform. Priscilla's grades dropped. Her attention to everything outside of Elvis faded. The world became very small and very bright all at once. When Elvis returned to the United States in 1960 after his military service ended, Priscilla was devastated. The separation stretched for years. Elvis wrote, called, and promised. Priscilla begged her parents to allow visits. At 15, she traveled to Memphis for the first time under strict conditions. Elvis began guiding her image during that visit, directing the makeup, the wardrobe, and the presentation that he believed suited the version of Priscilla he had already decided she would become. By 1963, when Priscilla was 17, her parents gave permission for her to move to Memphis to finish high school. The arrangement placed Priscilla not in Graceland itself, but in the house behind it, with Elvis's father, Vernon. From that point forward, Priscilla stopped being a visitor in Elvis's life and became a permanent fixture inside it. The marriage that followed would hold both dreams and damage that took decades to fully understand. The wedding that looked perfect but wasn't. Elvis Presley and Priscilla Presley were married on May 1, 1967, in Las Vegas, Nevada. The ceremony was small, private, and brief. Elvis's manager, Colonel Tom Parker, had been pushing for the marriage partly to silence years of public speculation about the unusual living arrangement at Graceland. The couple that had spent 8 years building toward this moment stood together in front of a small gathering and exchanged vows in a ceremony that lasted only minutes. Early in the marriage, genuine tenderness was present. Priscilla adored Elvis with the full force of someone who had shaped an entire identity around his world. Elvis showed affection and protected Priscilla from some of the pressures of public life, while also keeping tight control over her appearance and behavior that had always defined the relationship. 9 months after the wedding, on February 1, 1968, Lisa Marie Presley was born. The birth that should have pulled the couple closer instead exposed the first serious fractures. Elvis became distant during the pregnancy and separated himself briefly while Priscilla was expecting, telling her he needed space. After Lisa Marie arrived, the physical closeness in the marriage disappeared entirely. Elvis withdrew from the bedroom without a clear explanation. Priscilla later described the confusion and rejection of that period with remarkable honesty. She had gone from being the girl Elvis spent years pursuing across continents to a wife who felt invisible inside her own home. The shift was painful and disorienting in equal measure. The demands of Elvis's career provided an easy explanation for the distance, but the distance existed even when the touring stopped. Elvis was surrounded constantly by staff, friends, and the rotating cast of people that the Memphis Mafia brought into Graceland at all hours. Priscilla was present in all of it, and somehow still alone. The conversations grew shorter. The gifts arrived without affection attached. The man who had once called from Germany just to hear a voice now moved through the same house as a stranger, who happened to share the walls. Behind the famous image of America's most romantic couple, a woman was quietly disappearing from herself. The slow collapse inside Elvis and Priscilla's marriage. As the late 1960s moved forward, Elvis returned to performing with the big comeback that defined his 1968 television special and the Las Vegas residency that followed. The stage gave Elvis back the energy and relevance that the years of movie contracts had worn down. Priscilla watched the transformation from the wings. The crowds returned. The screaming returned. The admirers, the temptations, and the distance that fame produces all returned with them. Priscilla remained at Graceland most of the time, raising Lisa Marie and waiting for a husband who arrived home tired, distracted, and emotionally unavailable. The woman who had once been the center of Elvis's attention was now competing with an entire industry for a fragment of it. Elvis had begun relying on prescription medication by this point, using pills to sleep, to wake up, and to manage the pressure of maintaining an image and a career at the scale that Colonel Parker scheduled without mercy. The dependency progressed quietly at first, and then with increasing visibility to the people closest to him. Priscilla could see what was happening. The man she had known in Germany, the one who was present and attentive and full of energy and charm, was being replaced by someone unreachable. Elvis could not talk about his fears or his pain. He had never learned how to be vulnerable with the person who loved him most, and by the time the marriage had been in place for several years, the wall between them had become structural. Graceland was never quiet in a practical sense. Staff moved through it constantly. Visitors arrived without announcement. But the emotional atmosphere of the house, inside the marriage itself, had grown profoundly still. Priscilla began dance lessons in 1968. The studio became a room where someone paid attention to her, where presence was recognized and effort was rewarded. The instructor, Mike Stone, was warm and focused in the precise ways that home no longer offered. The affair that developed was not the cause of the marriage ending. It was the symptom of a marriage that had already quietly ended without either person naming it. When the decision to leave finally came, it arrived with a clarity that years of waiting could not have produced any other way. In 1972, Priscilla told Elvis the truth. The marriage was over. Priscilla had found something outside the walls of Graceland that made her feel like a person rather than a possession. The years of neglect, control, and emotional absence had reached the only conclusion available to a woman who had finally begun to understand who she was without someone else defining the answer. Elvis was devastated, and then furious. He had believed that Priscilla would always remain, regardless of his behavior, because she had always remained before. The idea that the girl he had brought from Germany and shaped into the version of herself he wanted had chosen her own direction over his was something he could not process cleanly. His reaction included anger and a possessiveness that Priscilla later described as deeply upsetting. The man who had not given her the attention she needed for years was now insisting on a claim that the relationship itself had not supported. Priscilla stood firm. In July 1972, she left Graceland. In October 1973, the divorce was finalized. Lisa Marie stayed primarily with Priscilla under the custody arrangement. The marriage that had begun with so much public ceremony and private longing was legally concluded in a courthouse without drama. What followed was not a clean break. Priscilla and Elvis maintained contact as co-parents and retained a complicated affection for each other that neither person was willing to let go of entirely. Elvis called, expressed regret, and made it clear that part of him believed the separation was temporary. Priscilla was building something new. A business sense that had always been present but suppressed began to emerge. The identity that had been submerged in Elvis's world for more than a decade started to find its own shape. The woman who left Graceland at 26 was beginning, for the first time, to discover who she actually was. Then came August 1977, and everything changed in a way that no preparation could have managed. The call that changed everything for Priscilla. On August 16, 1977, Elvis Presley was found unresponsive at Graceland. He was rushed to the hospital and pronounced dead at the age of 42. The official cause was cardiac arrhythmia, though the years of prescription medication dependency had played a significant role in the deterioration of the body and the heart that gave out that afternoon. The world that had spent 2 decades screaming for Elvis Presley stopped completely. For Priscilla, the news arrived as a specific kind of devastation that has no clean description. The love between them had changed form many times since that house party in Germany in 1959, but it had never disappeared. They were no longer married. They had not lived together for 5 years. But Elvis was the person who had defined the entire first chapter of Priscilla's adult life. And now that person was gone at 42, while Lisa Marie was 9 years old. Priscilla later described the moment in interviews with a grief that decades did not soften. The emotion was not simply the loss of a former spouse. It was the loss of the person who had seen her first, who had chosen her from across a room in Germany, who had been present for everything that mattered in the formation of who she was. Lisa Marie was devastated. At 9 years old, children understand absence but cannot process permanence. Priscilla became the anchor for a little girl who had just lost the most famous father in the world. The role of protecting and raising Lisa Marie, of keeping Elvis real and present as a memory while building a stable life in the aftermath of his death, fell entirely on Priscilla. The estate that Elvis left behind was not in good order. Graceland was costing hundreds of thousands of dollars annually to maintain. There were serious discussions about selling the property. The king of rock and roll had left behind a financial situation that threatened to dissolve the physical legacy of everything he had built. How Priscilla Presley took back control of Elvis's world. Priscilla Presley made the decision to open Graceland to the public in 1982. The decision was not universally supported. Critics questioned whether a private home could sustain commercial tourism at the scale required to justify the project. Priscilla believed it could and moved forward despite the skepticism. Within months of opening, the response proved her right. Visitors arrived in enormous numbers. The revenue transformed the financial picture of the estate entirely. The woman who had spent her teenage years and 20s inside Graceland, being shaped by someone else's idea of who she should be, had now taken full control of the place and turned it into something that would outlast everyone involved in its history. The acting career that developed alongside the Graceland project added an entirely different public identity. The Naked Gun comedy series and the television drama Dallas introduced Priscilla to audiences who knew the name but had never thought of her as a performer in her own right. The reception was genuinely warm. People began to separate the identity from the marriage in a way that had not been possible before. A long relationship with Italian businessman Marco Gabellini produced a son, Navarone Gabellini, born in 1987. The relationship lasted more than 20 years. Priscilla spoke publicly about the partnership with warmth and appreciation while consistently making clear that marriage was not something she was pursuing. The business interests expanded. The books arrived. The public appearances honoring Elvis became a consistent thread through the decades. A new memoir titled Softly as I Leave You, Life After Elvis is currently in progress. As of 2026, Priscilla's most detailed account yet of the internal experience of a life permanently shaped by one relationship. At 81, Priscilla remains a central figure in the Elvis cultural legacy and has begun hinting publicly at new creative projects for 2026, suggesting that the energy and the forward motion have not stopped. The loss that came after every other loss. In July 2020, Benjamin Keogh, Lisa Marie's son and Priscilla's grandson, died at the age of 27. The cause was a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Benjamin had been intensely private in a way that made the death feel entirely without warning to the family. Priscilla, who had weathered the death of Elvis and the years of struggle that followed, now faced the loss of a grandchild who had barely had the chance to live. Lisa Marie was destroyed by the loss of her son. The grief that followed was described by those close to Lisa Marie as the defining wound of her later years, a pain that did not soften and that affected her health in ways that became increasingly visible. Then, on January 10, 2023, Priscilla attended the Golden Globe Awards with Lisa Marie. They were there to support Austin Butler, who had won the award for his portrayal of Elvis in Baz Luhrmann's biographical film. Priscilla noticed that Lisa Marie did not look well that night. Something in the presentation was fragile, more tired than the occasion required. 2 days later, on January 12, 2023, Lisa Marie Presley was taken to the hospital after emergency responders were called to her Los Angeles home. She was 54 years old. The cause of death was determined to be a small bowel obstruction, a complication of bariatric surgery Lisa Marie had undergone years earlier. Priscilla's statement to the press described her daughter as the most passionate, strong, and loving woman she had ever known. The woman who had never remarried was now the last remaining member of the family that had formed at the center of the most documented love story in American popular culture. Elvis died in 1977. Benjamin is gone in 2020. Lisa Marie passed away in 2023. Priscilla described the loss of Lisa Marie in a November 2023 interview as unbearable, the feeling that a large part of her life had been physically removed. The grief was not abstract. It was the specific weight of a mother who had outlived the child she had spent everything protecting. The answer she finally gave. People spent decades expecting Priscilla Presley to remarry. She was young when Elvis died. She was beautiful, established, and admired. The assumption that someone would arrive to fill the space Elvis had left was so widely held that the absence of a second marriage became its own story. Priscilla addressed the question directly in multiple interviews across the years. The consistent answer pointed not toward grief or loyalty in the simple romantic sense, but toward something more honest. Elvis had been irreplaceable, not because Priscilla could not find love elsewhere, but because the experience of loving Elvis had permanently changed what love meant. Priscilla had seen Elvis in every private dimension that the public image concealed. The fear underneath the confidence, the loneliness inside the fame, the silence that prescription medications produced in a man who had once filled rooms with pure presence. To have known someone that completely, and to have watched that person disappear while still carrying the shape of everything they were, creates a specific bond that no subsequent relationship can simply absorb. Priscilla also acknowledged the loyalty that ran quietly through the decades. The sense that remarrying would represent a kind of closing of a chapter that had never fully closed. Elvis had loved Priscilla in his way, imperfectly and incompletely, but with a depth that the years and the divorce and the other relationships had not erased. The decision to remain unmarried was not a decision made in grief and then maintained through inertia. It was chosen actively, renewed by everything that happened afterwards, including the losses that continued arriving. At 81, Priscilla Presley is working on a new memoir, planning new projects, and moving through a grief that most people will never be asked to carry at the scale it arrived. The last living member of the original Elvis family. Still present, still building, still choosing the life that belongs entirely to herself. She lost Elvis at 32. She lost her grandson at 73. She lost her daughter at 77. And still, she kept going through every chapter of grief, fame, and survival. A life shaped by love, control, and unimaginable loss that never stopped coming. Like the video and subscribe for more stories that go far deeper than the headlines.